Growing up, I was taught lies about history, like pretty much everyone. But there's a lie I didn't know, I still don't know why they taught us. Because it's a lie that, when the truth comes out, totally transforms everything that's going on in the world around us. While the President of the United States is out there picking sides in the Israel Palestine movement, this is a part of a bigger issue that started 1400 years ago. When I was in school, I was taught that Jihad was the Muslim response to aggression of Christians from the Crusades. This seemed to make sense. Video games I played had Jihad only arise in a province after I had already launched a crusade against a province held by a Muslim nation. And so I came into my 40s thinking incorrectly that Christians were the aggressors against the Muslim nations. In reality, the Muslim expanse follows closely on the heels of the collapse of the Roman Empire. It really has nothing to do with religion per se, it has to do with a power vacuum. That, with Rome as a power gone, other states surrounding Rome found it a fertile opportunity to take Rome's territory and expand their own. And so the notion that the Crusades and the Jihad are somehow part of a religious war is only because they have been made so to be in modernity. I traveled in the end of 2022 and saw a majority of Spain, except for the provinces of Cordoba and Granada, because at the time they were embroiled in conflict and travel advisory for Americans was not advised. And it was in Pamplona that I discovered the truth of the lie. There are not a lot of interpretive sites in Pamplona, and none of them are in English, but I was able, with my rudimentary Spanish, to piece together that a large Muslim army had been encamped in the area now known as Pamplona, in what used to be the Kingdom of Navarre, which used to be part of a caliphate, and that from this base of operations, an invasion was made into the Frankish kingdoms that we now know as France. Accordingly, last May in 2023, I took the opportunity while in France to go to Tours, where a combined army under Charles Martel of the Franks, the Aquitanians, and the Britannians, anyway, the Celtic peoples of northern France, came together to defeat the Muslim invader army. Now, I already knew from my trip to Spain that Castile Leon and Portugal were the beginnings of movements to push the Muslims out of Iberia, who had come in to fill the power vacuum left when the Roman Empire fell. Rome fell, Germanic tribes moved in from the north. They actually brought Christianity with them, it appears, based on what I can see in Barcelona. And so Christianity was brought to Iberia only when Rome collapsed, and by the Germanic barbarians who came in to take their place. The Muslims invaded Spain, thinking correctly, apparently, that the German tribes who settled Iberia would be easy to subjugate, and they were correct. The Christians, then oppressed by the Muslims, then rose up in rebellion to drive them back out of their territory. And thus the nations of Portugal and Castile Leon, Navarre, and Aragon were born. Now, from there, it becomes a Christian versus Christian effort, with first Castile Leon trying to unsuccessfully to take Portugal, and then with Castile Leon marrying into the throne of Aragon, and then subjugating Navarre by force. Eventually, Spain was able to drive all of the Muslims back out of the Iberian Peninsula and secure it for Christians in Europe. This happened on the heels of other aggressions. The Roman Empire officially collapsed in 430 AD. Some dates of note: 200 years later, Muhammad was born, and the Muslim expansionism began. Over the next 100 years after Muhammad's birth, the Muslims would conquer the Eastern Roman Empire and take Byzantine Syria, Byzantine Jerusalem, and Byzantine Nicaea, pushing the Byzantines, or the Eastern Orthodox Empire, back to Constantinople, which the Muslims would eventually take later, which is why it's called Istanbul. Then they would continue to take Tunisia, which had been part of the Roman Empire, Sicily, Crete, and Morocco, all of which had been part of the Roman Empire. Then they invaded Spain, as I mentioned, crossed the Pyrenees, attacked Switzerland and France, were able to get to Rome, and it was only in 1095, what's that, 450 years after Muhammad pushed his people to attack Christian lands, that the First Crusade began. Now, I'm not arguing that the Crusades were a good thing. There were plenty of atrocities committed. There were atrocities committed for over 400 years before the Franks, as they are called, took the fight back to the Holy Land. The lie, then, is that Christians started this. I can't see any indication of any of the historical records that Christians invaded Muslim lands until 1095. Now, there was some push, like in Spain, as mentioned, in the around 800 AD, to push back against the Muslims who had taken Iberia. But most of Europe was still embroiled in defeating the Danes, who were pagans from the north and had nothing to do with, or pagans that live in what's now called Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and they were too preoccupied with that to even think about going into the Holy Land. Most of the Christian kingdoms were small dukedoms and principalities without much strength to take on anyone outside of Europe, and indeed, the client state England of the Kingdom of France was still embroiled in war, trying to establish its independence and hegemony over its original dominion. Of course, Britain, as presently constituted, is actually ruled by the Danes. So what we see here is actually Europe succumbing to the Danes, converting the Danes, and then finally, once the Danes, or Vikings, whichever you would like to call them, had become Christians, then turning their sights, now that their back was secure from other options, to those who were attacking them from elsewhere. You see, Europeans have nowhere to go. They were backed up against the sea, and so it was really a live or die moment. The Crusades then are justified as a response to the Muslim aggression, and not the Jihad, as presently constituted, as a response to the Crusades themselves. Again, I'm not justifying the actions of Crusaders, the massacre at Acre, or any of the other atrocities of which we are aware that occurred during the Crusades. The Knights Templar, particularly under Reynald de Chatillon, were particularly irksome, or under Guy de Lusignan, who would become the King of Jerusalem after Baldwin's death. There are evil men everywhere. The simple fact of the matter is that this did not start in Christian lands. Christians decided that they were tired of being subjugated and subject to the swords of foreign powers. Ultimately, we know the Crusades failed, and now the Muslims are invading Europe again. This time not with sword and stave, but with refugee and requirement. They move now in droves into other nations. And if you look at most of Britain's major cities, they are now governed by Muslims, who have somehow managed to achieve what Muhammad could have only dreamed of 1400 years ago, and taken control of the British Isles. The French must be pissed. All the while talking about jihad against and death to America as part of their anti-Christian movement. I find this ironic in that what I know about the Quran, they are supposed to respect and give deference to what is referred to as people of the book, meaning the books of Moses, if I understand it correctly. And as Christians, we believe in the Old Testament. Also the Jews, who are subject to also warlike aggression current in the Middle East, believe in the book, as I understand it. And so what I see here is barbaric violence from the religion of peace. A religion of peace that almost immediately upon its inception began a campaign of conquest against those who were different. This is not a tolerant thing. It is not a diverse thing. It is not an equity thing. It is the exact opposite of that. And when we learn about history, we learn that the truth is the exact polar opposite of what we were taught. That the religion of peace is actually the nation of aggressors, and that they continue to spread their vile and virulent voices and activities throughout the lands occupied by and peopled by people professing Christianity. It's rather remarkable that we have been sold this lie. It's rather remarkable that our politicians continue to enable and encourage the nation of Palestinian Muslim state against Israel, because there is a clear aggressor here. For 1,400 years, we have documented aggression of one group against the other that has been painted as aggression in the opposite direction because the Christians decided to respond. But it was Christian lands that were invaded and taken long before any Christians ever set foot in the land peopled by those to whom Muhammad preached and prattled. You know, the funny thing is if they would just leave us alone, we would probably leave them alone, because that's what Christ taught. But apparently, that's not what Muhammad taught, or at least it's not what those who profess to preach what he taught are telling the people they lead. And so we have a world that is run and revolves around lies, international conflict, national hatreds, oppositions, rebellions, and recidivism that arises because people were taught to hate people who did not commit a crime, who are no longer around to defend themselves. And so the world continues to turn. The great lies of history create problems today. The more you learn about history, the more you can protect yourself from those who would use you and abuse your time and talents for their own self-service. These are not men of God. They are men of gold, and they should be ashamed. I'm Doug, and this is my thoughts on the Crusades, the Jihad, and the Christian-Muslim question currently before us, as always, on the world stage. Godspeed, and may God protect you, not just from the swords of our enemies, but from the lies of the great deceiver who seeks to make all men miserable, regardless of their religious affiliation.